Well, welcome here. Rome had a strong tradition of public invective, or acerbic humor of a mocking kind, that was deployed effectively to provoke public shame and thereby control or manage the conduct of its citizens. Cicero, for example, was known for using powerful words, often laced with acerbic scorn, to defend clients, to attack adversaries, and to shape state policies while at the same time promoting his own public persona and identifying that public persona with the needs and desires of a community. His most potent words were reserved at key points in his career where Cicero needed to shape new aspects of his public presence. Mockery thus populated the corpus of Cicero during critical moments at which he wished to establish or re-establish his credibility before his opponents and their supporters. Now you might be saying, but Cicero was a statesman and a politician and in a higher league than Paul, the tent maker. Well, true, but given the ubiquity of Roman tradition of public mockery, Paul would have been profoundly influenced by it. Mockery was a powerful tool in the management and production of conflict and of shaping your public presence or persona. Mockery in its many forms was deeply embedded in the social fabric of Roman society. The topics of vituperation, the acts of passing blame and censure in abusive and violent language, or acts of ridicule, or acts of mocking, or making fun of, laughing at, were discussed by ancient authors in the context of studies of ancient rhetorical techniques. But more than that, it was socially performed medium of communication, and it was far-reaching in the attitudes and values it personified. It was deeply, deeply entangled within the ordinary features of life, such as religion, ethnicity, politics, food, sex, and kinship and of group networks. As such, mockery or invective was a potent form of communication that played an integral role in the social authorization and censoring of discourse and practice in antiquity. But more than that, mockery was also exposed the inhabitants of Rome to the fear of public shame to prevent them from doing wrong. Mockery supplied proof by identifying persons who were either fit or unfit for community, and mockery worked to portray a caricature of what a Roman was not to be. Now, Paul was embedded in such a social context of mockery, and not surprisingly, he harnessed fully the power of words to spark conflict on issues important to him and his groups. He used powerful words to curtail outrageous conduct antithetical to communal homonoia. And he used powerful words to censor those who were exposing him to public shame. As we shall discover, mockery was a powerful discourse of a more than benign kind, used reciprocally to stimulate debates on significant issues in the social milieu of competitions for honor, to outmock the mockers and thereby avoid the embarrassment of exposure, to evade becoming a spectacle in an eye-centric milieu, and to enhance the shame of visibility and what that might reveal about one's persona, or to embrace, the shame of visibility and what that might reveal about one's persona. Now, before proceeding to Paul, the ridiculed Paul ridiculing, I want to address one important issue. And it's this question here. Was conflict a unique phenomenon in the Pauline corpus when compared to other groups operative during Paul's time? A series of essays, that's question 2. No, that's it. So, a series of essays, or a recent study explores the issue of conflict and how groups, associations, and collegia engaged in conflict production and conflict management. That the mark of dynamic associations was the cultivation of rivalries, while at the same time also devising the means by which to mitigate them. I turn my attention briefly to John Kloppenborg's chapter in the Cameron and Miller monograph, Greco-Roman Theosoi, the Ecclesia, Corinth, and Conflict Management. According to John, the documentary evidence suggests that collegia or voluntary associations were frequently embroiled in social conflict of one sort or another. Rivalries, for example, were not uncommon between other associations or between members within associations. Many of these collegia deliberately provoked conflict externally and internally, but also had systems in place to manage and contain conflict before reaching divisive proportions. Fines were instituted for disorderly conduct at meals. Rulings were issued to forbid members from taking other members to court, and disputes between members of the associations were to be settled. Kloppenborg concludes, and I quote, "The Corinthian ecclesia was not up to something totally new and unprecedented. To the ancient observer, the Corinthian Jesus people would probably appear as theosopoi, any club that resembled domestic collegia or small cultic associations more than groups of immigrant metics who met to preserve their ancestral customs. The phenomenon of conflict within the Christian group and Paul's strategies for conflict management fall within the spectrum of conflict management seen in other collegia." Now, John makes evident that both conflict production and management were common features in how theosopoi and ecclesia ran their business. As we know, conflict is messy stuff, and it has an organic plasmic flow that is unpredictable. It disrupts, it destroys, it creates tensions, hijacks goals and future plans, leads to relational ruptures, generates invidious comparisons, spawns destructive rivalries, leads to name-calling and labeling, degrades reputations, inflames anger, and provokes mocking commentary. Conflict and mockery existed side by side. Indeed, each fed on the other. Where there was one, the other was sure to follow. Not surprisingly, in such a conflictual context, harnessing the power of words, mockery, to curtail disgraceful behavior, exclude potential lawbreakers, promote a public persona, shape communal policy, and cut down an enemy was not uncommon, and Paul was no exception. Under the pressures of ridicule and the sense of shame that it instilled in Paul, fear and anger were triggered. To counter the damaging consequences of fear of shame, Paul censored his opponents. The ridicule Paul ridiculed to inspire the same shame, fear, anger in his detractors, to control potentially their divisive and destructive behavior, which with the potentially negative consequences for himself and his groups, and to pressure them to give him status recognition that was his due, and we'll get to that point. Now, what emerges is that the groups with which Paul connected were dynamic, willing to wrestle with issues, some of them of their own making, and some of them of Paul's making. So conflict in these groups was a given, one might say endemic, and were not triggered by external forces only, but also by internal forces, with Paul contributing to the conflict, producing it. One of the lurking features in the production and maintenance of conflict, given that conflict could destabilize honor rankings, was that members of these groups and Paul himself had continued to face the fear of becoming exposed to public shame because of mockery. Indignantly, Paul retorts, "I think that I am not the least inferior of these super apostles." I mean, you can just sense almost the hostility, the anger in those words. He's making a case for himself. The defensive vocabulary of shame is frequent in Paul. Both fear and shame worked in tandem in him. A fear he attempted to transform to his advantage by focusing on shame, hoping thereby to mitigate the negative fallout of his shamelessness, or at least what he was being labeled with. By this means, hopefully, mitigating the corrosive power of mockery upon him, while at the same time pouring its acidic quality upon his rivals. So that by way of introduction. The paper has three parts to it. Part 1, words and the power to inflict and inflame shame. Part 2, the corrosive power of mockery. And Part 3, classes of mockery. So on to Part 1, words and the power to inflict and inflame shame. Now, to get at the power of words to inflict and inflame shame, we must have some understanding of the honor system operative in the Roman social world. For Romans, honor, if properly understood, was the foundation of morality. It was the most divine of attributes and bestowed upon both humans held in high regard and the gods. Shame and honor were flip sides of the same coin. Each contributed powerfully to the formation of the character of each inhabitant of Rome. Honor was thus a wide-ranging force in society that was created and maintained by individuals and by public opinion, and thus a potent form of power that moved people. Honor was something that one possessed, that defined an essential characteristic of humans, of gods, of cities, and groups. Honor stood at the root of what motivated humans to excel, and was not limited to them, but also applied to human institutions such as cities. Collectively, cities and collegia competed for it in never-ending desire to garner the favorable public opinion of the ruling elite. It was a value for which both men and women strove intensely, whether aristocrat or slave or anyone else in between, even children. Cicero, noting children at play, writes, "With what earnestness they pursue their rivalries, how fierce their contests, what exaltation they feel when they win, and what shame when they are beaten, how they dislike reproach, how they yearn for praise, what labors will they not undertake to stand first among their peers, how well they remember those who have shown them kindness, and how eager to repay." Now, given that honor was the basic motivation bestowed upon humans by nature, it was the preferred value over such things as wealth, noble heredity, high social bearing, family, children, and friends. Honor was a preferred value because it had the power to keep people away from vices and engaging in other activities deemed immoral or disgraceful. To avoid losing it, one had to avoid the enticements that vices brought with them. Cicero, for example, observed that the best citizens are not deterred from disgraceful behavior by a fear of punishment that has been sanctioned by laws, as much as by the sense of shame that has been instilled by nature and a kind of fear of just censure. The founder of the state and public opinion to cause this sense of shame to grow and refined it through both established custom and training. As a result, shame, no less than fear, keeps the citizens from doing wrong. Now, the fear of shameful exposure was a dominant motivator to deter citizens from engaging in disgraceful conduct. Maintaining honor that nature had instilled in humans was important. Censor or shameful exposure is where mockery looked for victims to impale upon the barbs of scorn. Citizens of Rome were aware that mockery's focus was something to be feared, avoided, and yet, ironically, also embraced in a culture of visibility, and more on that just a little later in the paper. As May notes, mockery takes its function from its goal. If the dread of blame fails to preserve order, the perceived violator becomes exposed to public ridicule and expelled from the community. Now, Paul was imbued with a sense of honor. It would have been a value he cherished and inculcated in himself and defended. If Paul's status, however, was in question because his associations had not granted him the right of that status, his attempts to ridicule, to provoke change, would have failed. Coming from someone amongst them perceived inferior, using the language found in Corinth, crafty, deceitful, of untrained speech, and a corrupter, powerful labels that once they stick, they're hard to take off. His claims to standing amongst them was ripe for mocking dismissal. Yet, in the face of a group not bestowing honor upon him, and the serious loss of reputation such an action represented for Paul, Paul had very few options. Paul was forced to resort to humiliating words to stimulate their sense of shame about their damning attitudes towards his honor standing, and thereby hoping to bolster his dwindling and depleted honor reserve. Now, in a study of honor and influence in the Roman world, Linden concluded that weighing honor was an unceasing process. Generals waged war for it. Persons of influence schemed for it. Philosophers argued philosophically for it. Teachers taught for it. Orators spoke for it. Paul grasped for it as his honor scale tipped dangerously in the direction of dishonor. The passionate indignation and contempt for the group is barely hidden in Paul's words, as he both defended his status and also exposed them to shame for their part in this indignity. Imagine a derisive, cajoling tone in his self-defense. I think that I'm not the least a second-rate apostle to these super-apostles. Or, I have behaved like a fool. You have forced me to do it. You should have been commending me. For I am in no way inferior to the super emissaries, even if I'm nothing. He throws that in. Now these are disdainful remarks. Even though of a covert and indirect nature, what he was saying was clear. It was Paul's hope that his condemning words for their failure to recognize his understanding among them, instead of commending him, would expose them to shame, which in turn would undercut their cherished sense of honor and arouse the overwhelming desire to avoid a dent in honor, and perhaps trigger a change of attitude towards him. Paul recognized painfully that without the Corinthian association, in this instance, giving him his status recognition, his honor had no cash value. His depleted persona had no real clout to bring about substantial change in the group. Now, I just mentioned cash value. Well, what do I mean when I say that Paul's honor had no cash value? A pecking order maintained and defied by honor was normal for the inhabitants of Rome. Establishing the notable credentials of the residents of Rome, along with ranking them along the social scale, were done through the currency of honor, a kind of banking system where what was honorable had some force that you could exchange something good for. One's claim of an honor standing before one's peers was exchanged by them into the material worth of honor. In the minds of Romans, attributes of honor were automatically cashed in for esteem, for dignity, for integrity, and reputation, or the converse, if the claimant's attributes were publicly unknown. And in the case of Paul, his attributes were publicly unacceptable. Hence, honor was never an assured element, given that it could be gained or lost at moment's notice, as courts of reputation distributed judgments at their whim. For esteem to exist, it had to find affirmation for those in the position to grant it. It is obvious from Paul's experience that honor was fickle, that his honor standing could at moment's notice plummet and be lost altogether, and it almost seems as if it had. Paul's honor was a public verdict of his good standing and personal qualities, if granted, but if judged otherwise, it was a public indictment of his good standing and personal qualities. The Corinthian group, again, going back to the Corinthian group, had applied slanderous labels on him, revealing their scornful indictment of his ranking among them. In such a context, Paul had very little to offer them that could be exchanged into the material worth of honor. And what he had to offer had little cash value in their minds. So what strategically does he appeal to bring about a reversal? Now Paul, aware that his honor currency was depleted, attempted to create such cash value from the little shreds of honor he still possessed by snidely calling attention to their disgraceful conduct, or vices, disgraces, evident in the Corinthian group. He refers to quarreling, to jealousy, to anger, to selfishness, to slander, to gossip, conceit, and disorder. But he also mentions impurity, sexual immorality, and licentiousness to stimulate the sense of shame that would have been instilled by nature, and a kind of fear of just censure to grow in them and become an irresistible motivator to deter them from engaging in the behaviors of which they had been accused. Moreover, his acerbic commentary was designed as a veiled threat to hurt them where it mattered most, the core sense of honor that they each possessed. Nature had bestowed it upon them, and nurture it they must, or else face the consequences. If he managed to devalue their honor currency, such a move might spur them to distribute honor upon Paul. So on to my second section, the corrosive power of mockery. Romans were aware that scornful words could be used strategically to curtail disgraceful behavior and promote a public persona. Advantageously used, mockery forcefully brought to bear a set of social linguistic behaviors designed to inflict pain, the pain of shame. To some extent, we are all aware of that mockery and laughter are complex human behaviors that have the capacity to both warm and wound. Who has not felt the sting of a pointed barb and its damaging aftermath? In a recent public diplomacy white paper entitled Ridiculed, an instrument in the war on terrorism, J. Michael Waller discusses the transformation of American public diplomacy and strategic communication and the use of ridicule as a weapon against terrorists, against weapons proliferators, and despots and other international desirables. Ridicule, he continues, leverages the emotions and simplifies the complicated and takes on the powerful in politics, law, entertainment, literature, culture, sports, and romance. Moreover, an argument, image, or kinetic force can be countered, but few defenses can be marshaled against the well-armed bait of barbs that bleed humiliation and drip contempt. The point is that ridicule is a highly charged medium of personal and social interaction and an integral part of a repertoire of socially enacted behavior and means of communication. Ancients were keenly aware of the power of insulting words to wound deeply, especially those that damaged honor and exposed shame. A passage from the ancient novel Lucidian Clitophon by Achilles Tatius makes this abundantly clear. Speech is the father of shame, grief, and anger. Like arrows aimed at a target and hitting a dead center, words pierce the soul and wound it in many places. One verbal arrow is insult, and the wound it leaves is called anger. Another is exposure to one's misfortunes, and this arrow causes grief. A third is a lecture on one's faults, and this arrow is known as shame. One common quality to all these weapons is that they pierce deeply but draw no blood. The only remedy for them is a counterattack with the same weapons. The wound caused by one's sharp tongue is healed by the razor's edge of another. This softens the heart's anger and assuages the soul's grief. If one is prevented by force majeure from uttering one's defenses, the wounds silently fester. Unable to reject their foam, the waves swell up and labor, distended by the puffing breath of words within. So as much as ancients felt the salty sting of scorn, so also we feel the sting of ridicule because it targets our attitudes, or targets core attitudes and values on matters pertaining to sex and status, ethnicity, identity, politics, religion, economics, culture, food, drink, and a whole host of other social registers. Commentary or laughter of a derisive kind on any of these issues touches us to the core and causes personal wounds that frequently are irreparable. Now, mockery of a consequential kind was easily transformed into anger and physical antagonism. One verbal arrow is insult, and the wound it leaves is called anger. Now, the passage is clear that scornful words awaken the emotion of anger. Romans were acutely aware of the danger that an uncontrolled anger represented. Anger created heated actions, and words that, if not restrained, frequently provoke crimes of murder and vengeance. Angry rulers unable to restrain their anger were a danger to body politic of Roman and citizens. Angry fathers and mothers were a danger to their children. Angry children were a menace to aging and vulnerable parents. Angry religious authorities were a threat to the laws and customs of religious polity and to the many adherents who were beholden to their dictates. In an excellent study of the emotion of anger in Greek and Roman philosophical texts, Harris points out not only the ambivalence in attitudes towards anger, but also its many positive social functions in the creation of harmony or disharmony between siblings, emperors and their citizens, masters and their slaves, mothers and fathers and their children, and wives and husbands. Paul and his collegia were not an exception to the rule. There were times when anger was justified, but for most part, anger was a powerful emotion. It had to be restrained. Uncontrolled anger expressed itself in vengeance or violence and was seen to be, something you shouldn't engage in. On occasion, anger, acting out of vengeance, was deserved, but generally it was frowned upon, especially when driven by a personal desire for reprisal. Under the influence of the Stoic philosophical tradition enjoining humanitas, harmony, mildness, and dignity, Musonius Rufus argues that the wise men should abandon anger and instead opt for mildness of character, even in abandoning going to court despite having suffered a grievous injustice. Now, of course, at times it's very difficult to resist an outburst of anger. For example, Cicero writes that when viri fortissimo, vigorous public men are injured, they resent it, and when they are angry, they are carried away, and when they are provoked, they fight. Most often, it was hearing the ill-timed words of scorn of a friend or foe, or collegia, that caused the blood to boil over in anger. Excessive shame spawned deep abhorrence for the instigators of the shame. The point is, the suffering the embarrassment of exposure in the eyes of others frequently provoke strong judgmental commentary and passion. Now you might wonder, what specifically ties this section on corrosive mockery and angry and its manifestation in Paul? Well, in reading the letters of the Corinthians, Paul appears to opt for what sounds to be humanitas, harmony, mildness, dignity. And he's often interpreted that way. Though the sense that one gets in reading the letters is that Paul is barely able to curb the desire to lash out at those causing him grievous harm, in spite of his mild clemency. Sometimes he could not hide his anger. When provoked enough, he lashed out. Paul resorted to mockery infused with a modulated anger as a kind of punctuation mark to strong words spoken. Galatians 2:11-14 records a troubling incident that took place between Paul and Cephas. Given the competitive nature of public life, this episode drove Cephas and Paul apart. Close associates, perhaps even friends, they became bitter rivals. The issue of food and eating with Gentiles sparked a divisive exchange between them. Cephas had made the bold decision that food and dining practices should not divide him from the non-Jewish populations. However, Cephas' eating and dining behavior came under the scrutiny by those in Jerusalem upholding the Jewish food laws. For them, what one ate and with whom was central to maintaining purity, group identity, and group boundaries. Cephas capitulated to intense public exposure to the fear that the Jerusalem party would inflict upon him a humiliating derision that he would not be able to live down. Fearing public embarrassment, he reversed his decision to avoid the shame. Now, the reversal placed him in direct conflict with Paul. Paul was clear that dining associations and food should not divide them from the Gentiles. The conduct of Cephas was publicly humiliating for Paul and predictably triggered an angry outburst, scornful commentary, and a public confrontation. Paul reports that when Cephas came to Antioch, he says, I personally, face-to-face, attacked him publicly, impugning his reputation because he stood self-condemned. Paul publicly wielded mockery's power against Cephas. He shamed Cephas by accusing him of being nothing more than a pretentious showman. Both Cephas and Paul were in the eyes, so to speak, of those in Jerusalem, as well as for Paul under the penetrating gaze of the Galatian group. Each represented public courts of reputation, ready to decide whether the actions of each brought shame upon them. The public court of reputation of the Jerusalem group represented the power to inflict shame upon Cephas. He must not ignore, because the shame dispensed at their hands was greater than the shame dispensed by the public court of reputation of either Paul or the Gentiles. And so also for Paul, given that his honor quotient was in a state of depletion. Cephas had managed to lead Barnabas into the same hypocrisy, along with also misleading the Gentiles, a kind of contagion that had to be stopped. Paul's scornful anger therefore was justified. It was used appropriately and at the right time to settle a conflict that could have reached divisive proportions. In this instance, Paul's anger functioned socially to bring about harmony between him, or at least attempt to bring harmony between him and the Galatian group, or at least so he hoped. The public confrontation and accusation of Cephas in the context of rivalry for honor clearly benefited Paul in three ways. It signaled to the Galatian group Paul's attempt to manage potentially disruptive and divisive behavior. It limited the internal conflict from reaching disruptive proportions. and it boosted, hopefully, Paul's public image. Now, the Cephas incident highlights the potency of ridicule as a social weapon. The bar could not have been lost, would not have been lost on the pillars of Jerusalem, who by implication were impaled by the same bar and condemned as fraudulent. The relationship between Paul and the Galatian association was strained. It was not favorably disposed to them. He was not favorably disposed to them, or they to him. In his estimation, they had been evil-eyed. You foolish Galatians! Who has evil-eyed you? And so extraordinary measures were required of Paul to manage and repair the breach. In such a strained context, he used the Cephas incident to remind them of the importance of group harmony, to warn them of reversals in their group in which they stood condemned, and obliquely to threaten them by wielding mockery's power against them. Would it trigger an about-face or reversals in them about him? Or would he stand self-condemned? Would they stand as self-condemned hypocrites, as in the case of Cephas? And I suppose we will never know. So on to the third section, classes of mockery. Classes of invective or mockery were clearly demarcated in the Roman tradition of ridicule. With a focus on the use of political mockery in Cicero, Corbeil discusses at length how he tapped into that, as Cicero tapped into the standard repertoire of accusations to curb illicit behavior and defend clients and so on. Cicero, for example, notes the most frequently used categories in rhetorical mockery: properties of the body, corpus, of the mind, animus, and of external matters such as rearing and background, or the externa. Cicero, in his divisions of oratory, draws attention to these three areas of accusation. These are the three of the chief points to be illustrated: how the person has been born, brought up, educated, trained, and morally constituted, whether anything great or unbelievable has occurred, especially of possible divine origin. Furthermore, whatever the person has thought, said, or done will be fit to the classes of virtues just discussed. The passage highlights the classifications potentially a focus of mockery, and it seems Paul fits these three classes of accusation well. He mentions education. He observes that he is untrained in speech but not in knowledge. He insists that his knowledge did not come through human sources but through extraordinary revelation. He notes his birth as one untimely born. He takes great pains to mention boasts, or boast about his ancestral background, and he is preoccupied about his occupation, to name just a few. And these three classes of accusation open for mockery mentioned by Cicero aligned well with other areas of accusation most frequently mentioned in the Roman tradition of public derision. So, for example, servile heritage, barbarian or being a non-Roman, holding a non-elite occupation, thievery, unusual sexual conduct, alienated or separated from family and community, gloomy disposition, unusual appearance, clothing or demeanor, timidity, and bankruptcy. Each of these areas was ripe for the picking for anyone wishing to wag the figure of ridicule at someone. Mocking, calling attention to a person's ethnicity, non-elite occupation, physical appearance, and behavior were particularly potent in curtailing unacceptable conduct, and hence were employed frequently. Each of these not only betrayed externally one's internal state, and hence was a reliable predictor of a person's character, but also provided a useful rhetorical means of social ostracism. As noted, a servile occupation was looked upon with disdain by the Roman elite and frequently drew snide commentary. Acts 18:3 observes that Paul was a tent maker or leather worker by trade. Paul refers to his occupation with some trepidation, and some would say with snobbery, because he was aristocratic blood. The question of Paul's social status notwithstanding, there is no doubt that Paul viewed his occupation with ambivalence. His appeals to the judgment of his collegia on his handicraft are not based on what he thinks about his occupation, but what they think, and what mocking aspersions they may have cast his way. It seems quite likely that they had passed judgment on his livelihood as a leather worker, and as noted, disdainful attitudes and disparaging remarks about his servile occupation would have undercut Paul's understanding and made him a liability. In the eyes of the members of his associations, not only was he beneath their dignity, but also that their links with him, and he with them, contaminated them with the contagion of his shame. Shame was to be avoided, and shameful persons were to be rejected. Shame could not be hidden or disguised. It was written visibly on the collective and individual body. Now, ancients relied upon reading appearances and what that betrayed about internal states, as I've just mentioned. Clues about internal states were embedded in ethnicity, in name, and bodily decorum. And on the basis of these clues, judgments were made about people's morality, about integrity, about generosity, about arrogance, hypocrisy. You think of the Cephas gang. The body was read as one would read a text, because upon it was written the thoughts lying behind aspectus, name, and cultural background. Faces, more than any other bodily feature, were read for what they revealed. Learning to read fleeting facial expressions and accurately deciphering their emotional content was something that the inhabitants of Rome spent a lifetime perfecting. The power of these glances and facial inflections regulated the conduct of aristocrats and virtually everyone else. Aristocrats, observes Lenin, went through life checking their conduct by reading the faces of their equals, from glances of the eyes, a raising of the eyebrow, a groan, a laugh. These regulated behavior. They were, continues Lenin, constantly under the watchful eye of their peers. Eyes, face, feet, hands, gestures, and gait, and what they revealed about internal emotional disposition were used to predict intentionality, character, and moral compass. Now, perhaps that is why Paul draws attention to what the Corinthians were saying about him. His letters are weighty, but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech contemptible. Conceivably, he had caught their censorious glances and deciphered their emotional content when he had been with them. They, in turn, had observed his bodily demeanor and movement, walking in a certain kind of way that allowed them to detect, that he was pathetic, and that his speech was shameful, and therefore the possibility of him being a morally deviant person. His external corpus visibly betrayed his internal reality, and what they saw, they seemed to, think was repulsive and despicable. We read in Cicero's work on the nature of the gods that the properly discerning eye can recognize deviance in a human being's movement in the same way that it can judge an art object. The appraisal of color and shape and that of virtue and vice are parallel activities, whether we read that or not, it doesn't matter. Needless to say, different codes and modes of walking and bodily deportment invited mockery. Cicero pointed out that unusual appearance frequently became the focus of demeaning accusations. In this connection, a brief discussion of the relationship of stigma to shame is essential. Physical appearance and deportment could serve as stigmata because they were open to public scrutiny and inspection. Facial or bodily deformity could not be hidden from public view, and if what upon it repulsed people, or caused averted glances, or caused rejection, or caused labeling, this constituted being stigmatized, an awareness that one had been devalued and lost status. Paul recorded that he had been given a thorn in the flesh, that he was of uncommon sight and contemptible speech, that he bore the marks of Jesus upon his body. Now, the stigma of uncommon appearance would have had a profound effect on Paul's social identity and also his bodily identity in terms of movement. In comparison to the social, cultural canons of beauty and honor, Paul's appearance appeared to fall short. In the brutal economy of looks or appearance, Paul was left open to the vicissitudes of public opinion and visual inspection, and suffered the shame of the less than kind judgments about his physical body. Appearance and mockery ran in tandem and required a response from Paul. He definitely had to respond. The question is, what should that response be? While Paul took up boasting about the marks on his body precipitated by floggings, lashings, and beatings with rods, for him, they marked his body with honor rather than shame. In Paul's estimation, they had the cash value that could be exchanged for esteem, or at least so his arguments seem to go. Paul took the course of making a stigmatized most important weapon in defending his honor and making himself known to the collegia in Rome, Corinth, and Galatia. The agonistic, cutthroat environment for honor was not working for Paul, so in such a cutthroat milieu, he decided that the shame game played right might gain him some strategic advantage. So what was considered foolish was wise, what was considered weak was strong, what was considered ugly was beautiful, what was considered powerless was powerful. These values were part of a court of reputation where living with a sense of appropriate shame under constant scrutiny accounted for honor. That Paul resorted to a discourse of shame is not new. We all know that. There's been plenty written about that. Various explanations have been put forward, one of which was that Paul rewrote the honor code, or that he was not playing the game by the old set of rules, but rather playing the game in a new key. My argument is that Paul did no such thing. Paul played the game within the acceptable social conventions of his day. The shame game was as cutthroat as was the honor game. The question, of course, is, how so and in what way? Now, Paul was aware, as was each citizen of Rome, that social convention required every person to carry a modicum of shame in a culture in which they were constantly in the gaze, in the eye. Aristotle noted the importance of being in the eyes of others when it came to matters of shame. He wrote that people are more ashamed of things that are done before their eyes and in broad daylight. Whence the proverb, the eyes are the abode of shame. That is why they feel more ashamed before those who are likely to always be with them, or who keep watch upon them, because in both cases they are under the eyes of others. All of this by way of saying that the mechanisms of shame were not unilateral, but operated along a continuum of becoming exposed by public shame to resigning oneself to being tested in the eyes of public scrutiny. Being in the eye of a spectating public required a modicum of appropriate shame and the willingness to be exposed. Now, particularly significant in this regard is Carlin Barton's monograph, Being in the Eye, Shame and Sight in Ancient Rome, which examines the social behavior of the eye itself and helpfully explains what it meant for ancient Romans to live visibly under the constant gaze of others. Barton situates her discussion of being in the eyes of others in the context of honor and shame that in a culture of visibility took on really significant concern. The gaze of the other was ever present and inescapable. Hiding from it would have raised suspicions about one's character and raised the specter of further, more intense scrutiny. Rome was a culture of visibility, or of public prominence, where everyone was easily noticed by and caught the attention of the group, of groups, of people, of individuals, of friends, family. Indeed, argued Barton, being in Rome was being seen. Now, by this she means that the gaze performed the important social function of constituting the essential nature of Romans. Being seen carried with it enormous risks, especially when being seen unaware, unexpectedly, intentionally, or calculatedly. Now, fully aware of the risk, however, those with a sense of honor and shame accepted the peril of being visible. Thinking here was that one's nature, including one's honor core, required testing and probing to see whether in fact it was real, actual, and current. Barton observes that the spectator was, for the Romans, an inspector, a judge, a connoisseur, and in such roles they are meant to hear, to behold, to observe, to see, to think, and to judge. Now, any culture of visibility, honor carried with it the notion that an honorable person was prepared to live in the tension of the readiness to be shamed and to live with a modicum of shame. Paul fully exploited the idea for his benefit by playing the theme of weakness, of shame, the fool, the willingness to accept insults. Paul fully exploited the notion that honor carried with it a willingness to be exposed, and that as members of the Corinthian group, back to them again, who cherished and inculcated honor, that they too should be ready to live in the tension of shame, of weakness, of humiliation, of foolishness, of insults and calamities, thus represented, at least in Paul's estimation, a standard currency of honor with a cash value exchanged easily for reputation, for fame, for praise, for respect, for influence, for renown. Now, Paul also made the Corinthians aware that they were visible to him. He insinuated that he was coming again as inspector and judge. And as one cognizant of the Corinthians' group behavior, they should be prepared to be examined and tested. Convert the shame of disgraceful behavior into an appropriate shame, defined again by weakness and foolishness and insults. He informs them that they are under scrutiny and calls upon them to attend to their words, conduct, and public demeanor. He reminds them that both God and others around them were called upon to be judges and spectators of oaths taken, words spoken, behavior displayed, and action performed. He warns them that he will not be lenient when he comes to visit them. If they have failed to meet the test, he will hold them accountable. His court of reputation had been loaded with the values of those living with a readiness to be shamed. So you too live in that readiness, he says to them. Paul played on the notion that his public court of reputation, a public court of reputation in which what was appropriate shame was now defined, had the power to distribute what was honorable, goods that could be easily transformed or exchanged for esteem. Now, one last little bit here. Along with such an approach, so strategically playing the shame game in a public that's visible, under which you're under constant inspection, Paul conceivably could have tried another. Some Romans adopted the strategies to buttress an honor and influence depleted by the pounding waves of ridicule. So this is another way around it. In his discussion of converting power to honor, Levitt makes the important point that the powerful and grand in Roman society sometimes used fear, threats of violence, ridicule, disingenuous flattery, and other means to coerce honor, which, while frowned upon, was nevertheless perceived and accepted as real honor. For example, those with honor who eagerly sought to fill out their depleted worthiness, but were unable to do so, often used fear or other methods of pressure to maintain their esteem by compelling constant individual signs of honor. Once the power to force specific signs of prestige disappeared, so also did the honor. A person who had power had proper claims to honor and was recognized as such by his peers, had no need to seek these signs of approval. It was possible, says Landon, to have great power politically, economically, and religiously without having the equivalent honor, but that power without honor was hollow and emasculated of its influence. Now, whatever Paul might have thought about power and influence in his collegia, it certainly seemed to lack the equivalent honor. As we already noted in 2 Corinthians 12:11, Paul huffily remarked to them that he was a fool. Indeed, they had forced him into playing the part of a fool. Why? Because they should have been commending him, and yet had not done so in spite of Paul indignantly reminding them that he was not at all inferior to the super apostles, though I am nothing. He continued on by piling up the boasts to buttress his flagging honor quotient. He boasted about his harrowing escape from Damascus, his heavenly ascent, and the exceptional character of his revelations, his thorn in the flesh, and the many calamities and hardships that he endured. Since signs of their approval were not forthcoming, however, in the words of Cassius Dio, Paul was irritated as if he were being slandered, and peeved as if he were being insulted. They were willing to endorse Paul, crassly seeking signs of approval. They reviled him for it and abandoned him and turned to others proclaiming a different gospel from the one that Paul had foisted upon them. Now, is it too much to claim that Paul unquestionably appeared to be seeking signs of approval from the members of his associations? Indeed, almost begging for them to fill up his depleted reserve of worthiness? The point was that possessors of honor were able to wield power because of the awareness that it was a possession everyone cherished, inculcated, maintained, and defended, and because of the enormous concerns that it was a possession that must not be lost. Honor had huge currency and was accepted as a medium of exchange. In their eyes, the cash value of Paul's honor was worthless and could not be exchanged easily for reputation, fame, praise, respect, influence, or renown. Even pulling the mockery and shame card to boost the markers of his social understanding did not help Paul. He found himself in the uncomfortable eye of a competition for honor that he ultimately appeared to have lost. Last little bit of conclusions. So in the world of Paul, rivalry for honor was ubiquitous. Elevating people to positions of honor or stripping of that honor was not uncommon. Name-calling, labeling, caricature were key instruments of disprobation in the attempt to knock people off their honor pedestals. Slander had special bite when it took place in public places because it was linked to the shamefulness that exposure brought with it. Paul took great pains not only to defend his honor status, even to the point of boasting about being fooled in a sarcastic way, yet exasperated. He admitted finally that he was a fool. His discourse of mockery, laced with sarcasm, anger, and veiled threat, was well marbled with layers of, well, what I would call almost pseudo-humility, self-deprecation, there was a lot of it there, spiritualized discourse, and designed to establish a public persona in keeping with what he thought his groups desired and what he felt would gain him the honor ranking he desired. Would that have been enough cash value he needed in exchange for esteem and respect? Whether Paul managed to pull it off remains an open question. Thank you.